to the August Monash Sustainable Development Institute seminar. This is a research seminar, and the idea of these seminars is that they are interdisciplinary or even transdisciplinary, and that they're conversations. So there will be time for questions afterwards. As Enza has said, if you could just mute yourself if you're not speaking, that would be great. And if you've got questions, you can put them in the chat, and I can relay them to Jerry at the end, or we can you can put your virtual hand up, or you can even turn on your video and wave your hand. One way or other will get to you. Before we get going, I'd like to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nations, on whose land Monash Sustainable Development Institute is situated, and where many of us are gathered today. I pay my respects to the elders of the Kulin Nations, past and present. I think Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander knowledge is absolutely integral to reaching those sustainable development goals, and that there's a lot that many of us can learn from Aboriginal ways of thinking. So today I'm really pleased to be able to introduce my colleague from the Faculty of Law, Associate Professor Jerry Nagstam. Jerry, his research focuses on the intersection between environmental law, politics, history and economics, and he has a particular focus on climate change and also on global biodiversity loss. Jerry is leader of the Sustainable Development Group in the Faculty of Law at Monash University. And I think it's a great time to do that. We're trying to explore connections between Monash Sustainable Development Institute and the Faculty of Law. And we have an affinity event, which is for researchers in MSDI and Faculty of Law on the 26th of August, where you can meet researchers from the other institute faculty and explore options for collaboration in the future. Now today, Jerry's going to talk to us about the really important issue of global plastic pollution and its regulation. Jerry's showing us how useful law is for thinking about that, thinking about sustainable development questions and answering that really perennial question of how do we get people to behave as we want them to. And law is very useful in setting up systems to get the best compliance we can. So Jerry, I'll turn it over to you, and I'll give you a little wave when you've got 5 minutes to go.
All right, thank you, Becky. And thanks to everyone for turning up today, and thanks to MSDI for hosting this. Now I'm going to attempt to share my PowerPoint slides with everybody, and then I'll begin. So hopefully this will work out all right. I'll do it that way, there's more room. So can everyone see that? Kind of thumbs up? All right, I'm just going to turn that view into present a slideshow. All right, yeah. So this is part of a broader sort of project book that's being carried out by members of the law school, led by myself, into the issue of global plastic pollution regulation. And we're examining how key states and regions such as Australia, the US, China and the EU are regulating plastic, and I'm happy to talk a bit more about that in the Q&A section. But I also wanted to examine for today kind of the global dimension. Now, if you look at this issue, and I have, generally plastic pollution regulation remains quite under-theorised. There's little written about it, particularly in the global space. But plastic pollution in and of itself is global in nature, but the majority of the solutions that have been proposed to the issue have tended to be national in nature. I would contend, though, that issues such as microplastics in the atmosphere, which I'll talk about a bit more later, are definitely not solvable at just the national level. And like anthropogenic climate change, there's a need for a global holistic approach to the issue. All right, so let's kind of put a sense of what is the scale of the problem that we're dealing with. Now, currently, the plastic industry achieves annual revenues of US $750 billion, and it's constantly growing in size and power as an industry, but we're also seeing increased production and consumption of plastics. And to give you some stats on the problem, since the 1950s, humans have produced roughly 8.3 billion metric tonnes of what is referred to as virgin plastic. But only 30% of this, roughly 3.3 billion, is currently utilised, but the rest of it ends up just discarded into the biosphere as plastic pollution. In 2016, we created 335 megatons of plastic material, and that was up from 322 million tonnes in 2015. It's the last years I can get figures for that. Problematically for us as environmentalists, only 9% of plastics are recycled globally. And if you're interested in how Australia does it, we also basically only recycle currently approximately 9% of the plastics. 8 million tonnes annually ends up in the world's oceans. And to give one horrifying stat, given this current rate, some people have calculated that there'll be more plastic by weight than fish in the oceans by 2050 if we don't do anything about the issue. All right, very quickly, there are different types of plastic pollution that would require different types of solutions for us. The most common is referred to as macroplastic, which are relatively large particles of plastic considered to be bigger than 5 millimeters. But recently, scientists have started to identify the issues of microplastic and nanoplastic pollution, all right? And microplastic is exactly what it sounds like. They're primary microplastics of a microscopic size, something like exfoliating particles or industrial pellets. And we also get micropellets when essentially, it's the most predominant form of microplastics, are fragments or fibres of macroplastics that are breaking down, usually due to photodegradation. The issue of nanoplastics is also proving to be quite problematic, and it's an emerging environmental concern because we've got environmental developments of those particular items, and they're being combined with further degradation of microplastics. So I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but we're finding that they're now basically in the atmosphere, and essentially we're breathing them in every day. Problematically, they're accumulating in the body at the intracellular level, which we think may negatively affect the cellular processes of living organisms. But the jury's out on that. Lame. Lawyer joke. If you look at what the international community is doing about this, and particularly the UN made global plastic and microplastic waste the subject of 2 resolutions in 2014 and 2016. And they understand that the problem of plastic waste is a rapidly increasing serious issue of global concern that needs an urgent global response. And it was also one of the core subjects of the 3rd UNEA meeting in Nairobi in December 2017 that I'll talk a bit more about later in a bit more detail. But the issue here for us is, how should we deal with it? Firstly, the UNEA report on marine plastic litter and microplastics, which was out of the 2017 meeting, said there are 2 potential solutions to global plastic pollution that I want to explore today. First, they suggested the global community attempt to resolve the issue under the existing framework of international, regional and sub-regional environmental instruments. And today I'll look at the current framework of international agreements that theoretically we could sort of shoehorn some of that in. And secondly, the international community could adopt, if they wish, a new internationally legally binding instrument that would somehow regulate the global plastic industry. And that'll be the second part of the talk I want to give today. It's argued that such an approach could see a cohesive and robust approach to the issue by targeting urgent and significant global curtailment in the leakage of plastic waste into the environment. Secondly, a new instrument like this could complement the existing conventions and provide, hopefully, global certainty to the global plastics industry going forward. It's not like the global plastic industry is going to go away, but we do have to basically find a way to deal with the waste that's being produced. And so the second bit of the talk I want to do today will focus on that. All right. So, I agree. While the majority of the regulation of plastic pollution remains a state issue at the national level, I would argue that the sheer size and ubiquity of the problem requires an international response. And so what I want to go through today are some of the key areas that we could use if we're minded to. We could expand them, we could provide more detail into them, and I'll go through them in a little bit more detail in a moment. But the key issues I want to talk about are the Basel Convention on Hazardous Waste, what's known as the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, MARPOL and the London Convention, which looks at the issue of marine pollution. There is now an approach of an ocean charter, which basically seeks to bring together states and large corporations to deal with the issue. There's the UN resolution on marine litter and microplastics that I want to explore in a little more detail. And there's the Convention on Long-Range Transboundary Air Pollution, which could, if so minded, deal with this issue of micro and nanoplastic pollution in the atmosphere. And lastly, we'll talk about the Global Plastic Treaty. All right. Now, some of you may be aware that with the Basel Convention, which essentially deals with the trade of hazardous waste, with the idea specifically to reduce it going into lesser developed countries, 2019, the members there agreed to what is known as the Norwegian Amendment to the Convention to both track and limit the trade in lower quality mixed and contaminated plastics, and they're now considered to be hazardous waste. The new instrument will take effect from January 2001 and will mandate that exporting states that want to export most mixed and contaminated plastics first need the consent of importing states, which is basically bound up within the Basel Convention for all types of hazardous waste. Now, deeming such waste to be hazardous is in line with very much the Basel Convention's overarching objective to protect human health and the environment against the adverse effects of hazardous waste. So it's a good starting point. Currently, the US and other states send lower quality plastic waste to private entities in lesser developed states without obtaining the approval from their government. Now, if we move as we're intending to as an international community, such a move would improve transparency and would require wealthy state recyclers to very much improve their sorting practices, which should have a positive effect on plastic recycling as a whole. And some of you may be aware now that a number of countries like China and Thailand and Malaysia are effectively saying, we're not going to accept this kind of contaminated waste. And as a country, they're perfectly free to do so. Hopefully the volume of contaminated plastic, which historically has flowed into lesser developed states, should be reduced. And that should hopefully also reduce the concomitant marine pollution, which has been a problem as well. But I would have to say that it's not going to end the ongoing trade in plastic waste, because countries are still free to accept that waste if they want to. And with other forms of hazardous waste, we have seen that there are still a number of countries that are more than willing to accept hazardous waste and plastic waste. Problematically also, the US, which is a major producer of plastics, has not currently ratified the Basel Convention and is refusing to join the process in creating any new instrument. And they tend to blame any plastic pollution on states such as China and Japan. And Marco Lambertini, director of the WWF International, sees the new instrument as a good first step, but he notes that, however, it only goes part of the way. What we and the planet need is a comprehensive treaty to tackle the global plastic crisis. So we'll come back to that point about how effective Basel can be later. All right. There are a number of other marine and pollution sort of conventions. There's two, the marine pollution referred to as MARPOL Convention of 1973-78, and the Convention of the Prevention of Marine Dumping of Waste and Other Matters from 1972, usually referred to as the London Convention. Both operate to limit marine plastic pollution from sea-based sources. All right. They're basically designed to prevent the pollution from large ships and the intentional dumping of waste at sea. The problem as they currently both stand is that neither of them are designed to deal with this issue of marine plastic pollution. Their remit is much broader than that. They're relatively successful in dealing with vessel source pollution, but that's only a very small part of the marine plastic pollution. At the moment, 80% of all oceanic plastic comes from land-based sources. So while they're sort of they can help with the problem, they're not going to address the major drivers. Similarly with the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, that's the only instrument that's specific to marine pollution that could potentially regulate land source pollution. Article 194 of that particular treaty maintains that states are obliged to take measures to prevent, reduce and control pollution of the marine environment, although only where plastics could be deemed to be a toxic, harmful or noxious substance. Article 207.1 states are required to put in place laws and regulation to prevent, reduce and control pollution of the marine environment from land-based sources. But UNCLOS to date has not provided detail on what type or how stringent these national laws should be, and nor does it to date specifically mention plastic. Now, the UN resolution on marine litter and microplastics I referred to earlier, at that third meeting in 2017, the various General Assembly members agreed to that resolution. But the resolution is unfortunately quite wishy-washy. It merely seeks by 2025 to prevent and significantly reduce marine pollution of all kinds, in particular from land-based activities, including marine debris and nutrient pollution. It certainly does not put in place yet any hard targets. And the US and China and India, not surprisingly, were most outspoken in speaking against the idea, arguing that what was really necessary here was voluntary action at the domestic level. Now, interestingly, and this has some potential, but is still sort of in a nascent stage, on June 9th, 2018, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, the UK and European Union signed what's become known as the Ocean Plastics Charter in Canada. What the Charter seeks to do is bring together the leading governments, in currently 26 states, and businesses like IKEA, Nestle, PepsiCo and Walmart, not surprisingly, very large producers of plastic waste, and civil society organisations to support its objectives and commit to taking action towards resource efficiency and sustainability with the plastic life cycle. What it calls for, if you sign up for it, is for 100% of all plastics to be recyclable and all manufactured plastic goods to have at least 50% recycled content by 2030. But again, two key producers of plastic, the US and Japan, have yet to sign up to the Charter, and I don't see much chance of that happening anytime soon, unfortunately. All right. I mentioned before about the issue of microplastic pollution, and certainly that is a new area that to date has essentially been largely neglected by analysts and regulators. There are two main sources that we can identify. First, what are called synthetic fibres that are shed and directed, such as from clothing. Worldwide, we think about 60 million metric tonnes of synthetic plastic textile fibres were produced in 2016, and a large percentage of that is in the atmosphere. Secondly, sources come from things like chopping up or grinding synthetic materials such as car tyres, which results in fine microscopic particles both inside and outside. To date, as I mentioned earlier, there's a high degree of uncertainty around this, how problematic this would be. There are some studies that indicate that there's a potential to produce inflammation following chronic inhalation. However, the Health Organisation last year put out a report saying that as far as they were concerned to date, the evidence here did not indicate that it was dangerous. So we're still in that phase of trying to deal with it. So I might refer that one over to Tony later. Right. Most of the world's attention has pretty much been on marine plastic pollution. So atmospheric pollution with these microplastics has largely gone unnoticed as a regulatory issue. The risk of living in what is sometimes referred to as a plastic smog is real, and I would argue demands more attention. We have what's known as the Convention on Long-Range Transboundary Air Pollution from the 1970s. And that's been expanded recently with what's called the Gothenburg Protocol. And the long-range transboundary air pollution, CLTAP, is basically one of the most successful international environmental treaties out there. It sets things for national emission standards for things like sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, organic compounds, and ammonia. It's been quite successful in reducing those gases being put into the atmosphere. The revised protocol from 1999 has the first binding agreement to include emissions reduction commitments for things like fine particulate matters, which could easily be expanded if we wish to as a global society to deal with the issue of microplastic pollution. There's been a number of researchers and commentators who have been arguing that this is the best way to go with that particular issue. But we can talk more about that in Q&A if you want. All right. I and a number of other people have sort of stressed, though, that utilising or modifying existing international legal structures is unlikely to offer that comprehensive solution to address ubiquitous plastic pollution. The global scope of the Basel Convention and the other conventions, while a good start, are unfortunately only specifically designed to address plastic pollution. Rather, each convention seeks to resolve its own particular cooperative challenge. And that's true of virtually every international environmental treaty. There is a movement in international environmental law to start to sort of move away from this idea of having subject-specific international environmental treaties to see how they're impacting on each other. All right? Again, I can talk more about that in the Q&A. Any proposed new treaty on plastic would need to overlap with those existing instruments, and one of the key issues here would be working out how they would do so. Such a convention, a new one, could help resolve the fragmentation of that existing legal regime and codify it in a more important and synergistic way. Coordination of the issue for something like this, if we look at climate change or any of the atmospheric treaties, is absolutely essential. All right. So UNEP is currently considered, the environmental program is currently considering several different approaches to which international law could contribute to a solution. The so-called option 2 seeks to strengthen existing legal frameworks, adding a coordinating component for industry, all right? So the fragmented approach. But option 3 says, let's create a new international legally binding treaty and regime. And UNEP, is, for those who know, or those who don't know, has often been instrumental in creating these types of treaties by just calling for them and building up consensus for it over time. UNEP considers that both options are technically and politically feasible, all right? But they need not be in competition, but rather complementary actions. Or alternatively, they could be a two-step process where we try to resolve the fragmented issues initially, but then over time, like with most treaties, we basically build a more comprehensive one. Now, coming to the last points I want to make, and hopefully I'm under time, Becky. For some, the transnationality of global plastic pollution necessitates a coordinated global response in the form of a treaty, and I would put myself in that camp. If you're going to do that, we need to learn some of the lessons from other treaties, both successes and failures. So what I want to leave you with today is a couple of things that I think would be absolutely essential if we go down this route. And again, we can talk about it in the Q&A. We would need binding global reduction targets. And any such target needs to be measurable and time-bound. We need to develop a strategy to achieve those goals, which requires national obligations and complementary action plans. And I would argue there's a place here for implementing the circular economy concept. We would need a plan to involve all the key stakeholders, in particular transnational corporations, which have a very outsized role to play since the major companies that produce this are relatively easy to identify and potentially bring on board. We also need to take into account the common but differentiated responsibility principle. All right? Lesser developed countries should not be held responsible for the fact that essentially developed states have over time basically produced most of the waste. So I would argue that we probably need the CBDR to be in there. While it's a problem for all of us to solve, it's not basically one that should be required for all the states. Critically, and if you know anything about international environmental law, you need to create a system to monitor progress on the targets and evaluate the effectiveness of any national action plans. So we'll need to develop global standards for the measurement of such effectiveness and data collection. In climate change, this has often been one of the sticking points. We would need to create a technical scientific body that could be listened to by the various conferences of the parties that would mandate states report on national progress in a transparent and timely manner. And if you look at some of the international environmental treaties that fail, for instance, like ones around tropical timber or tropical forests, this has often been problematic. The scientists have not been listened to on this area. We need to create formalised knowledge exchange networks between states, ENGOs, transnational corporations that foster cooperation. We need a global fund, or to give that responsibility to the Global Environmental Facility, to provide financial states to implement national action plans, particularly those that lack the national infrastructure and resources to do so. And most problematic is the idea potentially of maybe a global compensation scheme, similar to what's being proposed now in the climate change negotiations around loss and damage. All right. Again, we can talk about that a bit more in a moment, particularly for LDCs who have suffered ongoing plastic pollution. This would be a way to actually ensure that those countries could repair the damage. And there are a number of mechanisms that have been proposed over time where basically that could help deal with those issues. Things like a shipping tax or an aviation tax that could pay for basically a compensatory scheme. And Becky, that's all I have to say at this point in time. I open it up to questions. She looks mildly impressed.
Wow, you've blown me away, Jerry. Thank you. Now we've got one question from Santana on chat, and Jerry, I'll forward it to you, but maybe I might ask it for you.
Sure.
It's a really great question. So Santana asks, and Jerry, if you're able to get rid, stop screen sharing, that'd be great, yep. So we can see each other's faces. So what broadly has been the argument by the US or India in insisting on voluntary action instead of any binding obligations?
What has been their action? That basically...
what's been their argument?
Their arguments have been, unless everybody is part of the solution, then basically they don't want to be the ones, again, carrying the thing.
We've got a comment from Dr. Maria O'Sullivan from the Faculty of Law saying, whose area of expertise is refugee law, and she said, I think the global compensation scheme is really important, but could you elaborate on how it could be implemented, please? Thanks, Maria.
Oh gosh, okay. Well, unfortunately, if you look at what's happening with climate change, essentially it hasn't really been implemented in any way. So things like loss and damage, so the idea of loss and damage, where basically states can either sue for the damage that's been done to them by plastic pollution, or essentially allowing for states to basically get some form of compensation. At this stage, it's a completely out there idea, and certainly in terms of the environmental.
Question from John Thwaites. John, would you like to ask it yourself?
Jerry, I'm just wondering what the Australian government's position is. And I have heard the Australian government wanting to take initiatives in relation to marine plastic pollution. Where are they in this debate? And can Australia position itself to support these initiatives? And are we part of the Canadian agreement?
At this stage, forgive me, I don't think we're part of the Australian agreement yet. Of course, Australia could be basically part of the problem, but to date, in terms of hazardous waste, they really haven't been a player. It's been mostly the EU states that have been heavily pushing this sort of activity. I would very much like Australia to be involved in this, but to date, they haven't been, unfortunately.
Got a comment from Elena Karateva from the faculty.
Elena, who is working with me on this project.
Fantastic.
She can correct me where I've made errors.
Elena makes a really wise comment talking about the connection between COVID and plastic pollution, and says that this has probably been a major step back that we need to explore. There's been a huge surge in single plastic use around the world.
Yes, we have noticed that with COVID. Essentially, there's been calls to roll back any of the sort of plastic bag bans that we were experiencing at the supermarket, because people are afraid that basically the major handling of different plastics will basically transmit it. So yes, unfortunately at the moment, some of the more national schemes are under threat, particularly in the US, in California. And here there is some talk about it as well being problematic.
Thank you. And Liz Sideropoulos from MSDI has got a question. Liz, you're welcome to ask it yourself, or if you stay on mute, then I'll assume you're asking me to ask it for you. Okay, I think that's a me. So Jerry, Liz is asking, Jerry, to what extent do you believe the emphasis on voluntary behaviour change helps or hinders global efforts to manage plastic waste?
Well, I am a big believer in norms being incorporated into treaties and in behaviours within national states. So I would like to see that. But at the moment, the voluntary behaviour change, I see it as basically for a system to work, you need not only top-down communication about what's involved, but you also need bottom-up, voluntary, normative behaviour at the individual level. But at the moment, like most environmental issues, the governments tend to sort of say, oh, this is merely just an individual choice sort of issue. So we're going to leave it to the individuals as to whether they want to do it. That's not enough in my view. I think we also need basically global direction about how we wish to do it, but we also need targets that we need to meet. So it's a merge of the two approaches I find is probably most effective.
If anyone's got questions, you're welcome to put your real or virtual hand up. I've got Rob Raven there, and I've got a question too as well. I'll come back to.
Thanks, Gary, for a great talk and great thoughts on what a global regime would look like in this case. Just a question around where are you expecting resistance to establishing such a regime? So where do you expect pushback from which governments or industries or communities or workers or otherwise? Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Of course. Well, unfortunately, the US is usually basically the leader of the, let's call it the anti-plastic global regulation movement. But we're also seeing India, China, essentially also joining in with that. So as far as they're concerned, they're worried that an international treaty would put regulations on them. So from the lesser developed countries, the arguments tend to be, we don't want anything that will stop us developing our economies. Yeah? Now, married to that, like with the climate change debate, we also see effectively that we have large transnational corporations, particularly the plastic producers, who are also resistant to any form of regulation on them, both at the national and at the international level.
Okay, next question. Jerry, you've got everyone talking. It's fantastic. This is exactly what...
I just want to lean back and let people argue.
The format makes that difficult.
Yeah.
So from Sally Bashir, or apologies, Sally, if I pronounced your surname incorrectly, the question, Jerry, for you, how would you envisage the circular economy concept to be incorporated in an international treaty?
Sally, this is probably the most difficult question you could ask someone like that, because there hasn't been a lot of talk about how it might be incorporated into an international treaty. What you would probably do is basically do it at the national level. So you would encourage states within their various policies to incorporate that as a concept and then let it develop over time. I probably wouldn't actually mandate it, but I think any proper response to this will require a recycling circular economy approach.
And if you've asked a question, you'd like some follow-up or to make a comment in response, feel free to. Alina, I can see you've unmuted yourself. Did you want to say something?
No, I just wanted to add... Hey, Jerry. I just wanted to add to Jerry's answer to Sally's question about circular economy and its incorporation in an international treaty. So yes, I mean, it's not going to be a treaty on circular economy per se. So, but some elements of the circular economy can certainly be incorporated into international treaty dealing with plastic pollution. For example, the reduction of the raw materials used in production of plastic. So something like that. So yes, emphasis on recycling. So to use less of the raw materials, obviously, chemicals and oil, and reuse what we already have. So things like that.
I would add on that most international treaties should essentially be focusing on the top end sort of thing, setting a ceiling for how much plastic we produce and recycle, and then over time reducing that wherever possible. All right. So again, for us, it's about top down, setting the parameters for what we want to achieve as a global civil society.
Thanks, it's Sally here. Can I just ask a follow-up question that's not but linked? Would you imagine that a plastic pollution convention of any sort would include lost fishing gear, or would you leave that under the FAO Law of the Sea?
I would leave it under Law of the Sea, bluntly, sort of thing, because normally with most of these treaties, you want to keep it as focused as you can on the key major issues. And I wouldn't see that as a major issue to date, sort of thing. Providing the issue can be dealt with effectively, it's probably more likely to be dealt with by the current law, under law of the sea.
Great. And the next question, Beverly from the Faculty of Law.
Hey, Beverly.
Hi, how are you? Thanks, Jerry. That was great. And treaty would be a fantastic solution. I mentioned to you that there's this Four Corners show that played last night and a few nights ago on recycling, unpacking the myth of recycling and the huge lobbyists of the plastic industry, which is, I know where you're coming from, but wanted to know your views because the show said very cynically that the whole thing about recycling was a myth propagated by the plastic manufacturers of the world to show that they're doing the right thing and pushing the whole responsibility onto us as people, but really it should emanate from the manufacturers. So your thoughts on that?
Well, as I mentioned in the presentation, we're only doing 9% recycling at the moment, both in Australia and globally. So clearly we have a problem. You can point to countries like Germany, which kind of have the point-to-point sort of plastic pollution over the life cycle. And that's kind of, what we really want to do. Yes, I do think there is an element of greenwashing occurring here, where basically plastic producing companies are saying, well, we are dealing with this, there's recycling occurring. But given how widespread the trade is between this contaminated plastic that's being sent primarily to lesser developed countries, clearly we are not dealing with recycling in an effective manner.
Thanks.
Maria.
Thanks, Becky. That great presentation, Jerry. Now,
Maria.
you know that I'm not an environmental specialist, so please understand I come from a place of ignorance. But my first question is about why a treaty and not a compact. And apologies, you may have addressed this. I missed just the very first part of your talk. But in refugee law, there's been a push to have compacts rather than a treaty for various reasons. And for example, we don't want to reopen the 1951 Refugee Convention, but also the rationale is countries will sign up to a compact rather than a treaty. Now, I know you canvassed the issue of voluntary behaviour, but I just wanted to canvass that issue of a compact. And then looking at other regimes like the business and human rights movement, which are seeking to, I guess, more directly address the human rights and environmental practices of businesses.
Well, we can already see there's obviously a lot of, and I didn't talk about it today because it's not the focus of my talk, but there is an element to this of e-waste as well. So a lot of the computers that we're sending to countries like Pakistan for basically little children to break down also have a plastic component as well, and we can constituted waste. So there is a massive role to be played, I think, for the business and human rights movement to sort of highlight that effectively by not dealing with it within your own producing country, like here in Australia, that basically that's having human rights consequences overseas, particularly in lesser developed countries. In terms of a treaty and not a global compact, well, I'm an international environmental lawyer, so I'll always plump first for what's called a framework treaty, which is basically the idea that we agree, at least initially, that we have a problem and that we need to deal with that. And then over time, basically we build into it enforcement mechanisms, enforceable targets, etc., etc. So I'll always prefer a treaty to sort of a global compact. Most of the agreements we have, like the charter I was referring to, they're already kind of voluntary. And while there's an important role for that allows, as Beverly was pointing out, too many states and or individuals to say, not my issue here, I don't want to have to deal with it.
Tony.
Yeah, no, thanks, Becky, and thanks, Jerry. That was
Honey, I so want your views on microplastic.
Yes, I think microplastics and nanoplastics are potentially very important health issues. As you say, they're under-researched at this point, and there hasn't been the attention paid to them yet. But there is an emergence of interest and concern, including from well-engaged universities in sustainability like Arizona State University, for example. So I think we'll hear more about that. And I just wanted to pick up on this health dimension, though. I think a number of people have mentioned plastic waste in the context of the pandemic. And I think that is a really important issue. And of course, here at MSDI, Alicia and Julie and others are looking at this important question of when might we use reusable PPE that you wash and autoclave, when would that be appropriate relative to single-use PPE? Because our frame of reference tends to be that single-use plastic is more hygienic and safer. But in fact, in some contexts, that's not true, and particularly when we think about... they've got healthy barks there, Jerry. So particularly, you know, starting to think about the ethics of this from a healthcare point of view, that the harms that the healthcare practices might cause beyond the hospital or the clinic. And so this is potentially a way to engage with the healthcare system, which, you know, in the United States is now 17% of GDP is healthcare, and enormous volumes of plastic waste from the health system, not just the PPE. So such a wide variety of things here. So I just wonder, to what extent is healthcare, our health workers engaging in these kind of conversations with you and others around the world? Are they engaged as yet?
I don't think they are engaged yet. And certainly, as I tried to stress right at the beginning of this is such a new area of regulation. The book project that Elena and I are working on will be the first book in this area on the planet. There have been a number of articles written about it, but really it's been incredibly, I keep saying it, under-theorised and under-researched. So there is an enormous scope here, I think, for both ourselves in the law school, but also I hope maybe MSDI. And one of the reasons I wanted to give this presentation today, not just because Becky asked, but because I do think this is an issue that basically will require a transdisciplinary approach. And there is plenty of room for Monash and MSDI to move into this space. That's my plug, people.
Yeah, no, excellent. I think that's terrific, Jerry. Thank you.
Thanks, Jerry, and some really good points on the chat too. And keep posting your comments or questions there in chat. From Maria Sullivan, Faculty of Law, so I think that we need public education campaigns in every country on the dangers of plastics. And Bridget is responding to a point I think Tony was making, or perhaps the one that Maria was making, Bridget Sadler from the Faculty of Law, that this would also include all of the lab equipment involved in testing covering around COVID.
Yeah, pipettes, all that material sort of thing. We've got so much of it. So,
Any other questions or comments? You can put up your hand directly.
I should say that I'm giving the PowerPoint slides to MSDI so they can post them as is, because I know I went through them relatively quickly. I wanted to leave more time for Q&A.
Thank you. Another question, Becky. Jerry highlighted the role of the plastics producers in this, and once again, it was interesting that they were part of the Canadian agreement. In Australia, if we're going to do this in a transdisciplinary way, are we able to engage with plastic producers, and have you had any contact with them? Is that something that we should be doing?
I haven't had any contact with them yet because we're still putting the material together for this in a sense, and we wanted to do that. I have been, and I think Laura Lee might be here somewhere from environmental engineering. We've had a number of conversations around the need to be dealing with sort of this, and also to be engaging stakeholders. I'm also working with Dana in business and economics sort of thing around some of this. It's becoming an issue that I know the Australian government wishes to sort of resolve the recycling issue here in Australia, and they are putting some funding towards those goals, with a goal of having solutions by 2023. So yes, there is a lot that we could be doing here in Australia, and the government seems minded to start doing some of it, because if we cannot send up plastic pollution anymore overseas, if China, Thailand, Malaysia, which is the countries we've been primarily sending it to, we have to deal with the issue.
Tony.
Yeah, just I guess picking up on that point about the way we might engage with business, and in certain places in the world, businesses that with packaging, for example, have a responsibility throughout the life cycle of the packaging. And you see that, the edge of that here in Australia with IKEA, for example, where you can actually leave the packaging on site and put the item into your vehicle, for example, before you go. To what extent is that kind of responsibility being engaged with by business in this space?
I think there are a number, like IKEA as a charter to the Canadian sort of agreement. So they're a charter member. I do think, and I have not done this yet because, as I said, we're right at the beginning of this process, but I do think there is scope for MSDI and Monash and the law school to basically start to approach basically some of the producers and sort of start helping, giving our help or proposing our help for some of these problems that they've got. But I would say, I keep stressing, I'm right at the beginning of this process. So some of these questions I cannot answer, but I would very much like to over the next year or so.
We're getting in on the ground floor today, Jerry.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Elena?
Sorry, I have an interesting question by Rachel. What about the need to develop plastic alternatives? Now, yes, of course, there is a scope for that, but my concerns, from what I found out, it's we're either going to be creating another pollution problem, or we're going to be putting valuable resources such as growing corn and soy to make plastic, which doesn't sit right with me anyway. So I think whilst there is scope for that, the focus shall be on recycling, reusing, and reduction in the overall use. So where possible, of course, again, not every industry. We can't remove single-use plastic from every industry, including medical industry, for example, at the moment. So it's a kind of very multifaceted. We need to think about it as sort of a multifaceted problem that requires a range of various solutions. And of course, one of them is developing plastic alternatives within reason.
Thank you. And a question for those of you who have a behaviour science focus. Of course, Behaviour Works Australia is part of MSDI. And it's a question from Bridget Sadler, who's on the research development team at the Faculty of Law. And it's around whether or not there are some behavioural science insights into changing behaviour around plastic use that could be, I guess, used hand in hand with what Jerry and Elena are talking about around the legal regulation. Feel free to jump in, or that might be an open question.
Comment on this, because this is kind of what my PhD is looking at. So I'm actually looking at single-use plastics through a behavioural science lens and focusing almost exclusively on the role of social norms. So I'm so glad that Jerry brought that up. And whenever I get asked this question about, whose responsibility is it really up to the consumer, I give almost an identical answer that we need everyone playing their part, and that includes the regulators, because we didn't necessarily go through the full Behaviour Works method in setting up the PhD, but when I was doing that first kind of systems mapping or scoping out the system approach, I learned very quickly, as Elena was just saying, it's very complicated, it's very convoluted, there's so many different things. And recycling, for example, is an option, but it's not the be all and end all. In fact, it's the last thing that we really should be pushing. Alternatives to single-use plastics are okay, but as was just mentioned, it's going to create other single-use waste problems. There's going to be land use issues. I think someone in the comments mentioned this around growing things like cotton and alternatives. So really we need to be, I hate to bring it up again, but circular economy is kind of the best answer, where we change the entire system, which includes a big element of behavior change, because we need people to stop treating items as single use. We need to start moving towards a reuse society, which from a behavioral science perspective, we can do bits and pieces, but it really needs an interdisciplinary approach. So I don't think I answered the question, but there's my insights.
Thank you. And that was Kim Borg from Behaviour Works Australia speaking. And thank you, Kim. It's really great to have you here. Any other questions or comments? Well, I just want to say thank you to Jerry and also to Elena for your comments today. We've had 44 people here today, which is really impressive given that we are under a state of disaster. This event today is really the start of us at Law and MSDI, and those of you who are in the Faculty of Law and at Monash Sustainable Development Institute, including Behaviour Works. We've got an affinity event on the 26th of August from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. And the aim is for researchers from across 2 institutions to meet each other. And we've got 5 different themes for the day. The first theme is around, if you're interested in doing work, collaboration around Indigenous perspectives. Next theme is social inclusion, which includes global movement, gender, race, and also clinical practice. That's probably thinking about legal clinical practice. There's a theme around health, a theme around water, and a theme also around corporations, institutions and governance. If you're interested in meeting other academics and potentially collaborating in the field, if you're at MSDI and Law, you'll be hearing from Bridget or myself or Rob Rubin or Enza about that, and please do put your hand up to participate on that day. But please join me now in thanking Dr. Jerry Nagstam on presenting. It was really great, and thanks very much for being so on time and getting that discussion. It was a great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Jerry. Thanks, Becky. Great
today.
moderation. Thank you,
Appreciate it.
everyone.
Thank you.
Hopefully
Thanks.
we'll work again. Hey, Abby.
Thanks for the
Well done.
comments, everyone, and great questions.
Oops.